This is the Westside King's Church podcast, where we aim to encounter and embody the surprising grace of Jesus.
Beginning a new Short Circle series focused around this idea of creating a culture of goodness or growing a culture of goodness, or I'm trying to think of even a slightly more passive word, allowing a culture of goodness to develop around us. Do you think those are sort of good ways to say what we're trying to talk about?
I think those are fair words.
I think it's important because there's challenges. Maybe we'll talk about this in the course of our conversation this evening. I think there are challenges about establishing church culture and using language that's too aggressive about what it looks like to develop a church culture. But before we get to that, perhaps the question, we begin a series, if we're saying, okay, how do we grow a culture of goodness in our church? Perhaps the opening sort of place we need to begin is, like, what do we mean when we talk about church culture?
Yes.
Do you think that's a fair place to start?
Yeah, and I think it's an important place to start because at the end of the day, culture is what's shaping us all the time, and almost everywhere you go has, a culture that you're consciously, subconsciously taking in as you're having experiences from the things that you're seeing, the words that you're hearing come out of people's mouths. All of that is a culture that you're participating within, and it ultimately shapes you. You go to, you go to Costco, they all wear the same clothes. Like you don't know where anything is in the store. That's a part of their culture. Right? Like no matter where you go, they always want you to get that rotisserie chicken that's really cheap at the back. Right? Like that's all a part of culture within places. And the church is no different. The church has a culture. And I think oftentimes we're not aware of it, or we don't get paid enough attention. We just assume we're all followers of Jesus. The culture has to be good because we're all here for the same purposes, but that's not always the case.
Yes. Yeah. I like, there's two phrases that I quite like, and you might have your own. We all have our ways of how we understand a concept. And for me, two ideas that I've liked about culture. Number one, culture is how things get done. So if you try to understand what do we mean by culture when we're talking about it within an organization, within a community, within your family, the question is, how do things get done? So I think about, most supermarkets you go to nowadays. Like I have this inability to find anything in a supermarket, and invariably will ask somebody for help for pretty much everything I'm looking for that I don't regularly buy. So outside of basically chips, I don't know where anything is in the store. Right? And I go to the store all the time and I can't ever remember. And so what I've noticed is all of the big supermarkets, if you stop any employee and say, hey, listen, I'm looking for dip for my chips, they will immediately stop whatever they're doing and take you to the place. Right? Even though I'd be quite happy with them just saying, hey, it's aisle 14, or, hey, go to there, but they never do that. And so the more and more I've seen this happening, you realize, there's a culture somewhere where somebody behind the scenes has agreed at some point that when a customer asks us for help, this is how we're going to help them. To the extent then that one day I was in a store and I asked somebody for help, and they said, oh yeah, I think that's on aisle 13 or 14. And then they carried on working. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? This is not how things ordinarily get done around here, right? So I like the idea of the first level. How do things get done in our church? What's the methods, the ways, the processes, how people are treated, who gets asked to be involved? All these things are questions about how things get done. I mean, does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems, feels for me reasonably straightforward in that sense, as far as a good definition of how culture is shaped even.
Yes. And then the second definition of culture that I like, that I've just come across recently, a little darker, but but it said your culture in your family or the organization you work for, your community, your street, or your church. Culture is the worst behavior tolerated, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so a little darker. What does that bring to mind for you?
Well, I mean, when you stop to think about it, you're like, oh, I can see how that's how that makes sense, because it's the stuff that you let slide, and ultimately the stuff you let slide is the stuff that you say you're okay with,
Yes.
even though you may not be okay with it. At the end of the
Yeah.
day, if you don't stop it, if you don't speak into it, if you don't change it, it becomes a
Yes.
part of, again, going back to this first definition of how you
Yes.
do things, how you get things done. It starts to find and filter its way into that, which can potentially become problematic. It may be values or things that you don't want to have a part of
Yes.
your culture.
Yeah, and I think like if you're in it, I often think a good place to think about culture is your own family, and that might be, you know, if you're somebody with your own kids, then basically your whole life is committed to culture, and you've realized how hard it is to develop good culture and how easy it is to develop bad culture. You know,
Yeah.
it's amazing. I was joking with a friend recently about how it is that you can teach your children to say thank you for every single thing that they're given, and yet after like 9 years, it still feels like we're not getting anywhere with that. And then
Yeah.
and then one day they hear one bad word in the schoolyard one time, and they've remembered that bad word forever.
Yeah. And it's the first word out of their mouth around the dinner table. I'm like, listen to this new word.
And so there's always that sort of challenge.
Yeah.
But then there's, you know, but even if you know, if you don't have children, your own family has a culture, how you talk to each other, how you engage with each other. What does a family get together look like? What is acceptable? What is not acceptable? All of these things relate to you know, how things get done or the worst behavior tolerated. But why is this important for churches to talk about? You know, because that seems to me like you know, we're having this conversation as a couple of pastors, you know, in our church context. Why should we talk about culture in church? That seems to me, perhaps that's like, well, wait a minute, you know, why don't we just do a Bible study, or why don't we just get on with things as normal? Do you have any thoughts about that? About how do, you know, what's the significance of a conversation about culture for you personally?
Yeah, well, and I think it goes back to, you know, kind of what I said at the start. I think it's easy to make a lot of assumptions when it comes to church culture and life and what that looks like. The biggest one being, well, we all follow Jesus, so we're all going to have the same values, and we're all going to have the same thoughts, and we're all going to, you know, function under similar kind of guidelines and ways of being. And so it can be really easy to just almost ignore everything that's going on around you, because you almost put blinders on in some senses to say, no, it's church. We're good. We're good. We follow Jesus, or we say we follow Jesus, and right. And that automatically makes us good. So culture kind of becomes a secondary thing. We start to just think about we can start to think about programs and outreach, and, you know, and various different parts of church, which are not bad in and of themselves by any stretch of the imagination. But if you forget culture, if you forget about how you're doing what you're doing, we can miss the point. And I think it's a critique that you see Jesus give constantly when he looks at the religious system of the day. I think that's one of the biggest critiques that he gives to the religious system of the day, is to say, it's not good. What you're doing is not good. You say you're for God, you say but I really do think that that's a bit of a culture piece. They're not focused on how they're getting done what they feel they're supposed to be getting done. And it's problematic.
Well, again, yeah, there's that sense that most churches, if you talk to, you know, anyone from any church, what is your church trying to do? By and large, a lot of these churches will say very similar things.
Of course,
you know, we're trying to talk about Jesus. We're trying to introduce people to the freedom of the gospel. We're trying to help the world reflect God's kingdom more. But the challenge is the A to B, isn't there? It's how are
100%.
we going to get there? How are we going to go about doing those particular things? And to me, that's the sort of piece that that gets lost so often in my experience. But so, but just to give a little book plug for a minute. So a book that you and I are talking a lot about, and we've had conversations about as church team and things like that, is Scot McKnight and Laura Barringer, his daughter's book, Church Called TOV. Nice little visual representation there for us. Scott says this about culture in the book, which I thought was really, really insightful. Tyson, he says, how we understand and feel about our relationship with God is formed and fostered by, he paused it right there. How we understand and feel about our relationship with God is fostered and formed by what? And I'm curious as to what most of us will complete that sentence in our head. We'll fill out the rest of the sentence. What is it that shapes and helps us understand our relationship with God? And I think we all know what we think the answer is supposed to be. My prayer time, my reading of the Bible. McKnight says this: how we understand and feel about our relationship with God is formed and fostered by the culture of the church we're in. That's like, okay, so there's a kind of high stakes statement. He continues, he says, yeah, you know what I mean? And he continues and says, we tend to equate how we stand with the leaders of the church and how we stand with the congregation with how we stand with God. So this is a really interesting insight, that your view of your position in your church, of how you relate to your church, of how your church relates to you congregationally and even with their leaders, seems to affect our understanding of how we relate to God himself. And that's pretty huge, isn't it?
Yeah, those are some pretty weighty statements that we need to take seriously. Like I don't think Scott in these moments is pulling something that's way out there and really stretching something. I think he's actually onto something when you just look at how people are acting and how churches are are behaving and all of those things. Like it's an accurate statement as weighty as it is, and that's why I think it's an important one for us to stop and seriously think about.
So essentially what McKnight's saying is, if by way of example, if you are told by your church that you're not good enough, if you're told by your church your behavior is substandard, if you're treated like you are not an equal member of the congregation by someone in your congregation, there is a likelihood that will impact our view of how God thinks about us. If your church tells you you're not good enough, there's a high likelihood that you will think that about God's relationship to you. So culture now becomes hugely significant, doesn't it?
Oh yeah.
So and I think that particularly in a Western context, I think we struggle with that, because we like to think of ourselves as kind of as islands. We like to think that no, I define who I am. I work out my own story. And so it's a little humbling almost to suggest that the psychological evidence and sociological evidence is that our community that we're part of, the group that we're part of, is hugely formative for how we see ourselves, and our relationship with God so often impacts and affects how we see ourselves, doesn't it? So you sort of think what's going on with your church and how you understand your church and the health of your church become fundamentally and functionally important parts of your discipleship. Would that be the right term to use?
I think so, because I think that there would be a statement that would say everything disciples. Now that's a very broad statement that you can take a lot of directions as far as even how you set up a building, but culture would fit into that context to say your culture disciples. It's a part of the discipleship process of how you work out what it means to follow Jesus in day-to-day living is based on the cultures that you participate in that are trying to help foster those. And so it's why you see, and there's a wide variety of, examples that you could start to go down, and I don't want to pick on one specific one, so I'm not going to go down any rabbit holes necessarily, but it's why you can see certain places within the world, certain denominational affiliations can have different areas of excitement, of passion, of what they think is really important, that can really be driving them, because it's the culture piece that's driving that. It's how they're learning, how they're figuring out what it means to follow Jesus, how they're working that out. And at the end of the day, it's a culture piece that they've created.
Mm-hmm. So think about that comment then, where you talk about the creation of culture.
Yeah.
So it's worth us thinking, and I like to try and draw this back to your own family, because I think all of us, we know our own family intimately, right? Yes. And whether your family is, your wider family of brothers and sisters, whether it's your relationship to your parents, or whether it's your relationship to your own children, should you have them, how do you end up with the culture that you have? Right. And for me, I think you see this kind of process wherein there's a story told about who we are. Right? This is the type of people we are. And somewhere, someone at some point in the family decides, this is the type of people that we are going to be. And then that person starts to act out or model that way of being. And this to me is always the really interesting thing, because for a lot of people, I think we have moments in our lives, whether it's our boss, our father, our pastor, where we hear what they're saying. So this is the story they're telling. But the next question becomes, does that follow through in the way that they live? Sure. And going back to our point, everything disciples. So your culture is shaped and created often not by what you say, but by actually how you live out what you say. I think that would be, that's pretty commonly known sort of position, isn't it? And we our lives tell the story we think we're living. But then so we've got, what is the story we're trying to tell? How do we actually live that out? And does the story we live out reflect the two? But then how we teach and articulate, and then how we defend that story. Right. So, I want to raise polite children. So I'm going to tell them to say thank you after every time they're offered something. But I have to then first internalize that in my own life and say thank you when I'm offered something. Then the question becomes, how do I behave when they don't say thank you? Right. How do I, using a very simple example, but I think a lot of us can relate to probably at some point a parent saying, remember to say thank you. Right. But this is cultural shaping, isn't it? It's cultural. And the child then learns to know and grow that actually this is what is expected of me, and therefore I know whether I'm kind of in line with the culture expected or not.
Well, and there's a right and a wrong way to shape that when the culture doesn't go the way you want it to, right?
Yes,
to take that example, if a kid doesn't say thank you, is shouting at them in front of everyone the greatest way to get that culture instilled in them?
Yes.
Probably not, because could you get them to start saying thank you? Probably, but it could be driven out of fear and embarrassment.
Yeah.
And that now is becoming, again, it's the stuff you let slide. It's how you do it and what you let it, like get away with. And that would be a way that you can shape culture that appears good, but has actually been shaped poorly.
Yes. And of course, that's the kind of key I think point to mention at this point, that it's not that some churches have cultures and some churches don't have cultures, but rather more that every church has a culture. And oftentimes the culture is just something that you sense and feel, whether it's good or bad. You'll get a sense after a while in any group that you're a part of, but a church is no different, of, well, this is the type of people we're trying to be. So if you come to Westside, for example, hopefully you'd hear us regularly say, we're trying to be people that embody and, encounter the surprising grace of Jesus. So that's what you hear us say. The next question will be, do you see us live that? Do we look like people who are in, and that becomes how we treat each other, how we treat you, how there's a whole host of levels then of questions that come along in terms of how we do that. We're talking through the series at the moment about a goodness culture, shaped again by some of the thoughts we encounter in Scot McKnights' book that we're thinking about, that when you see something happen in our church, what's the driving intention, really?
Yes.
And when you choose one particular culture, so like by being a culture that theoretically hopes and dreams and desires to be shaped by grace, you should see that at moments when there's a sort of grace versus law, sort of tension. The hope would be that our culture would lean towards grace, that would lean towards sort of thinking that things. Likewise, we're talking about this series, Great to Good. What we're hoping is that as you push in towards something, the choice becomes between doing the great thing or doing the good thing. We want to lean towards the good thing, not necessarily the great thing. And that depends on how we lead worship, how we preach sermons, how we do acts of justice, all these sorts of questions.
Yeah, and I think this is where Scott picks this up really well within the book, and it's very practical. And I mean, he picks a few specific examples that he walks through of churches that may or may not be known within an American context, but to say, here's some of the problems of, yes, the church has a culture, but here's some of the issues of what a not good culture might look like and how it might appear. But then he also works through this model of what he says, he believes a healthy church is going to look like, a church that is TOV, which again is the word for good, right? In that sense that he's building off of. And I don't know if you have that there in front of you, in front of the book or in the book at this point in time, because it might be worth listing, at least as a beginning of the conversation. We're not going to cover all of them tonight necessarily.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth listing Scott's thought process to say, and he draws it as a circle, if I remember correctly, to
That's
say
correct,
these
yes.
things all flow together and they're constantly, they move together, right? It's not a linear this, and then this to get a good, they're always, kind of in motion together. So do you have that?
Yeah, I do. So McKnight talks about then, if we're going to grow culture that's rooted in the idea of being good, he lists these 7 categories which he thinks we should take seriously, right? So number one, and he says basically, these are habits that we nurture which will push us towards goodness. So there's a lot of threat and a lot of tension towards not being good. So let me read them. So, and I think about what he's saying. He says we must nurture empathy, right? So therefore, we resist a narcissistic culture. We must nurture grace, so we resist a fear culture. We must put people first, therefore resisting institutional creep. We must tell the truth, which means we must resist false narratives. We must nurture justice. Therefore, we must resist the loyalty culture. We must nurture service, and therefore resist the celebrity culture. And we must nurture Christ-likeness, therefore resist the leader culture. So there's an implicit criticism just by reading that sort of 7 categories from McKnight here. And the question at some level, Tyson, I want to put out there, as despite it perhaps being an uncomfortable question, is there, I know my answer to this, but I'm asking you first.
I feel like this is going to be an unfair question that's coming to me first, but
do you think there's a failing in the Western church right now when it comes to the cultures that we establish and develop in our churches?
Yeah, now you are throwing that. You would throw that to me first. I think quite simply, yes. I think you're seeing it start to pop up in the worlds of social media and news outlets that are able to help spread things so much quicker, and we become aware of so much more that's happening than just what's going on within our own city. I think you're starting to see it be spotlighted a little bit within larger contexts. And again, I will use the ones that Scott uses within the book, which is James McDonald, and the name of that church has slipped my mind. Is it Harvest?
Harvest Bible.
Church, anyways. Yeah. And Bill Highballs at Willow Creek. Those are two very larger prominent places within the US context that Scott kind of uses as case studies in some senses to spotlight this failing in a lot of ways. There's other ones that would be larger in the public, like Hillsong and Carl Lentz and some of that storyline that has happened, kind of within the last 18 months or so.
Christianity Today have been running a podcast series on that we call The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Church around
with Mark Driscoll. And so I think you're seeing a lot of light being kind of shone in on these spaces. And it's starting to be exposed. And I think in a good way, it's starting to not be tolerated. And I think as some of those larger ones are, they're opening up conversations for other people to see some of what's going on, maybe within some of their own contexts or whatever's kind of going on. But I do think that there has been a failing, I think, in some of just the structures that I think have been created within the Western church that have just almost been set up for failure. So I would say, short answer, yes, but now it's your turn. So I'm not letting you off the hook. I'm not the only one answering that one.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't expect you to. I think, so let me just go through McKnight's circle once again and just, have a listen to these words. So, good churches nurture empathy, but there's a dark side to that. Why do we need to nurture empathy? Because we've got to resist the narcissistic culture.
Yeah.
And I think that's a culture that is present in our broader world, not just within the church, but it's creeping into the church. This the rise of, I mean, goodness, do I need to defend or do I need to argue that our culture is narcissistic? Spend 5 minutes on Instagram if you disagree with me. And if by the end of that 5 minutes you're still not convinced we're narcissistic as a people, then we can have our argument, right?
Sure.
So then what about nurturing a grace culture? And I love what McKnight, grace is not the opposite necessarily of law. It's the opposite of fear.
Yeah.
Right? And you see, when we're afraid, we start to create rules and we start to lock things down and we start to object to things. Then he talks about putting people first, resisting institutional creep. And this is a huge one I think you see in so many church contexts, that the organization becomes more important than the people. The organized, it's like, well, the church or the company or the whatever it is. Like I'm a soccer fan. You hear this all the time. No player is bigger than the club, right?
Yeah.
Well, and in one sense, we go, okay, I get what they're saying there, but when that starts to creep into church and it becomes, no person is more important than the church, that becomes quite dangerous, because we start depersonalizing and becoming an institution and an organization before a gathering of people. Telling the truth. McKnight then talks about telling the truth, and the truth in all of its glory is such an uncomfortable thing so often. The temptation, once you've started to develop if you have a narcissistic culture, fear that protects the organization first, the truth is always going to be a slightly spicy thing to have around.
Yeah.
And then he talks about justice, nurturing justice versus loyalty. So do we do what is right, or do we defend the organization or defend our culture or whatever? Celebrity culture, he talks about service versus celebrity. You see this in so many contexts where you watch leaders of churches being treated in ways that should make us uncomfortable.
Yes.
Right? In ways that not because they're church leaders and we should treat church leaders badly, but because humans don't do well with celebrity, despite our consistent, for all of recorded history, our human attempt to not believe that. we don't do well with celebrity. We don't do well with that sort of thing. And then finally, this notion of Christ-likeness. It struck me. I remember as a young student at seminary, Tyson, noticing as I was kind of, this leadership culture was really beginning to ramp up. So, Bill Hybels' books, John Maxwell books, everybody was producing. If you walked into a Christian bookstore, just leadership books. And I remember asking one day in a seminary class, why is it in all the leadership books, David is used as an example, Joshua is used as an example, Moses is used as an example, Jesus is never used as an example. So, Jesus just was always like, it was like, here's what we can learn: leadership lessons from David, leadership lessons from Solomon, leadership lessons from Elijah, nothing from Jesus. Right? And I realized as I got older, it's because Christ likeness and leadership culture don't work well together. Right?
Yes.
Because, well, let me correct that. They don't work well in the larger culture that we're in.
Yeah.
I think they should work well together. I think Christian leaders should be Christ-like, but you're not going to look like the CEO model of leadership.
Yeah, the traits that they were highlighting as the important ones to have as a leader didn't fit with the model of Jesus.
Exactly. So I'm not avoiding your question. Don't worry about that. So do I think when I hear McKnights Circle and I think about my experience of church in the Western context, I think there is a variety of infections that have gotten into the church that have helped us miss the point, right? And start to forget about what it is that church is called to be. And I think, so is there a failing in the church culture in the Western world? I think yes. And yet at the same time, I'm actually, and the proof of that, I think, is exactly as you said. There's this increasing list of high profile churches that people are beginning to uncover what's going on behind the scenes in them. And I don't mean this with any sort of voyeuristic pleasure at, oh, look at these big churches having difficult times. But I am encouraged by this because I do believe that God is, Jesus says, I will build my church, right? Not we'll do it, but he'll do it. And so I'm actually encouraged that there's almost something happening in the church wherein unhealthy cultures, you said it, and I really love the way you said it, are just not being tolerated anymore. There's a move and a change happening across the world, which is actually to try and root ourselves back into the way of Jesus and what it looks like to try and be his people, really. So in a weird way, all of these podcasts like the Christianity Today one on Mars Hill, books like Tove, which for the first half talk about Willow Creek, it's depressing listening and depressing reading sometimes, but there's let me say it like this without sounding too super spiritual, purifications like that sometimes. You gotta scrape through the sort of mud and the gunk and the dirt and all that to get to what God fundamentally is committed to on the inside. So I'm actually strangely hopeful about the place that we sit in at the moment. Now, some people might call that just complete naivety, and I'm just going to call it this absolute refusal to believe in anything other than the resurrection. And if Jesus can come out from the dead, then the church is always going to be okay.
But I 100% agree with you on that. And I would say I too am hopeful for all of the reasons that you've stated, and just by my own conversations that I've been privileged to have with people that have been willing to share with me their own journey with church, some with wounds and some who have walked away from church contexts for various reasons. And it's not because Jesus was actually that offensive to them. In fact, they just wanted to see more of Jesus at work in those places. And when they started to dig into certain, to reading scripture, they started to ask questions, and then the questions got brushed off and they went, well, this doesn't make sense to me. So I'm actually slightly hopeful for the people that I know in my own life with this shift of it not being tolerated and us starting to say, no, we want to refocus on what it means to follow Jesus, and we
Mhm.
want to relook and reconsider everything that's been set up to say it's
Mhm.
fine if we keep some of it, but let's make sure we keep it for the right reasons because it lines up with how Jesus would want it to be done. And the stuff that
Mhm.
we've just carried because of tradition, maybe we consider dropping things that maybe don't line up. As hard as it may be, because we may say, whoa, this is how we've always done it. This is what it's always been like. This is, new territory for us. I'm hopeful for my friends that I actually think just desperately want to see the goodness piece come to the surface. I think if you push them, they'd say they believe it's there. They, I think if you push them, they would say that,
Mhm.
but they just haven't seen it. And so I'm hopeful for the conversations that are happening, for the accountability that we're starting to see happen, for um, the tough conversations that we're getting challenged with as church leaders from culture and from people outside looking in, to be willing to pause and to look at everything and say, is this good?
Mhm. So let's jump in then. We've got this sort of circle that McKnight talks about, which we kind of set up as a frame for our conversation
Yeah.
for the next few weeks. So let's just switch then gears as we jump into that to talk about how we start to build in our own lives. Let's talk about it from our own point of view, because that together will form us into the type of congregation that we're trying to be.
Yeah.
McKnight begins to talk about empathy and begins to talk about how we resist the culture of me, the narcissistic culture, the culture that sort of makes me the most important sort of thing out there. There's a variety of texts that we could sort of look at. The one that I just had in mind um, is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, right? Which I love the Sermon on the Mount, so I
Yeah.
probably overquote it. But hey, if you can find a better sermon than Jesus' own sermon,
Yeah.
then,
I think you're in
um,
pretty good space to quote that.
but I was thinking about this. Right? Think about Jesus' list of who he lines up as people that God blesses, right?
Yep.
So happy is the one, or blessed is the one, and it's Matthew chapter 5. You have the poor, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. You have those who mourn. You have the humble. You have those who seek justice. You have the merciful, the meek, peacemakers. I always love that term, and even people who are persecuted for doing what's right. This is the kind of Jesus' list of people. He says, "Hey, this is what the kingdom of God is made up of. This is
Yeah.
the type of people that God calls us to be."
Yeah.
Um, and I was thinking about that list of people and God's call for us to be like that list of people, and realizing that this shouldn't surprise us, because Jesus' whole ministry pursues people like that. Jesus
Oh yeah.
is focused on the oppressed, the marginalized, the downtrodden, the people that everybody else ignores.
Yeah.
Whereas what we're seeing often in church culture is that the people that everybody ignores in the world get very quickly ignored in church as well.
Yep.
And therefore our empathy levels, our compassion levels don't match up with Jesus.
Yes. Yes. And I think it's fascinating to think about. And I think some of it starts to dip into celebrity culture and some of that stuff as well, of just who gets the most attention. But I taught about some of this stuff this past weekend, and the Sermon on the Mount was one of those primary things that we really wrestled with. And I loved, and I quoted it in my sermon. Shane Claiborne picks up on this in his book called The Irresistible Revolution. And essentially what he says is he says, often we just do what makes sense to us and we ask God to bless it. And he says, instead of just doing what makes sense and asking God to bless it, we would do better to be with who God says is blessed, and then we don't even need to ask. It's just what God does at that point in time.
Yeah.
And I love that thought around this idea of the sermon of the meek and the, and the peacemakers, and you can go on, and those who love their enemies, and how we don't seek revenge. And
yeah,
it's a fascinating thought process, actually, in some senses, in Shane's very profound quote, if you ask me, just around how we shape things, how we do things, this culture of empathy. If you're going to be with those people and you're going to be those types of people, you don't even have to ask for God's blessing. God said that those people are blessed. They're going to be taken care of. That is the kingdom of God. That is what it looks like. And so, it's the empathy piece is massive, and it's still an issue in church cultures, for sure. And Scott even in his book, lists a number. He had like a bunch of types of people that you may see with it, right? Like of who may have it, who's maybe hasn't experienced, and ways for opportunities to show this empathy and this compassion model too, right? And he talks about about widows and the physically challenged, and women in various positions of leadership, and I mean, it's sorry, I cut you off though.
Yeah, no, I was agreeing with you. I think, like, to state the obvious, right? Like I am part of a category group of people. I've mentioned this before. Everybody knows this. This is no great secret, but I'm in a category of people that is about the most privileged in the world, right?
Yes,
I am a white straight man, right?
Yes.
And so like there's no group of people in history that'd be more privileged than me and my group, right? And and I can speak English. That puts me into further privilege. I have relative economic freedom, so that puts me into further privilege. I can read, I can write. I have an exceptional education, and I don't mean that. I don't mean that as in, look how good my head. I mean, like, I have literally had the privilege to go to university for far too long, right? Of my life.
Yeah.
A kid asked me the other day, there's like, when did you finish school? And I was like 36, and and I've got all of this privilege, and so when I walk into church, so often a welcoming church, to me, in my experience, and I've been in churches all over the world, but whenever I walk into a church, it's amazing how welcoming that church can feel to me. And if all I did was change any one of those categories, think about it. We turn up in church. Hey, let's all sing together, says the person that starts the song, or that starts the songs. Well, what are we going to sing together? We're going to sing these words on the screen. These words which are written that you will read in English.
Totally.
So now that we assume straight away, if I actually tell you what, let's all stand and sing together, because there's another category I should have mixed in there, asserting my privilege once again. I'm able-bodied, right?
Yes.
So let's all stand and sing together. So now I have to be able to read, I have to be able to read in English, and I have to be able-bodied to fulfill that command. And that most of us would hear that phrase, let's stand and sing together, on a regular basis in church, and not even think twice about it, right? That's just like, that's totally well. Now add different disclaimers to that. What does it mean as a father of a daughter? What representation of women does my daughter see in Christian leadership? We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with Holly, right? What if you're an Indigenous person, First Nations person that wants to follow Jesus? Or what if you're, from other parts of the world? What if your race or ethnicity is not white, essentially, right? What if you're single? Church is not always a great place to be single, because it seems like we're on this absolute mission to get everybody married.
You're going to go put me down around. I think we have absolutely destroyed that one as just very poorly handled. But
if you do get married, we immediately ask you how many children.
And how many kids are you going to have? Because everyone can have kids, right? That's just again, there's another privilege in that. Like, it continues to go out from there, of the assumptions that we build upon.
Then all of our songs are happy. So if you're depressed, then maybe this isn't the right place for you.
Totally.
what if your marriage broke down? But what if you're divorced? And is that something you feel comfortable? What if your sexuality, doesn't fit quote unquote Christian norms? All of a sudden, is it now a safe place to be?
Totally.
When you're at church? We have youth groups aplenty. If you're this age, there's a whole group for you. If you're a little tiny bit older, here's another whole group for you. And if you're a little tiny bit older than that, here's another group for you. But if you're old, elderly, and infirm, again, I'm not trying to sound like I'm just pouring scorn on everything, but I feel almost as an exercise in how compassionate are we actually as people when we gather together as the church.
And I think it's a good exercise, because I think you see really quickly how easy it is for us to just resort back into our natural wiring, our assumptions, how we view the world based on our own privilege and our own experiences. Like you said, for you and me, it's really easy to make a lot of wrong assumptions about right, how empathetic and how compassionate we think we are, or a place.
A question, right? Think about it like this: how often somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, is your church family friendly?" And if everybody says yes. Like, I've never yet met someone, no. Our church, everybody else says yes. But actually, the truth of that is, well, what happens when a baby cries in the service? Right? And when a baby cries in the service, now we find out whether we're actually family friendly or not.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, it's what you said too, with your friend who's a professor at the Bible college near us, who says, the kids take up the offering.
Yes.
And that's all great. And we all think that's cute. But when a kid drops the basket and money goes flying everywhere, how do we respond? And it stuck with me that when you told me that story, I've constantly thought about it, to go, it's so true about what you say as a culture and what you think about and how you treat people and what you actually value in those moments.
Yes. And so the challenge for the church when it comes to compassion, well, actually, let me, there's a line here from McKnight. He says that often the culture in the church merely reflects the culture in society at large. So if our society focuses on the able-bodied male, white male, straight white male, there's this list gets longer and longer. English-speaking, educated white male, and there is a sense that culture does focus and emphasize that. Is it possible the church then just starts to replicate that and just starts to continue that? And what would Jesus then do? Right? To quote that well-asked question. But if you notice, Jesus moves into a world, and you notice how often Jesus is messing around with the culture that he's in. And I mean, messing around, that's not the right word, Tyson. That's far too small a word. Jesus intentionally subverts the culture.
Yes.
So,
Yep.
And where is McKnight talks about having an empathy radar. Right? Where Jesus has an instinctive bias towards the marginalized, the ignored, the downtrodden. So his disciples come to Jesus and go, "Okay, Jesus, there's a lot of people out there and they're all getting hungry, and we should tell them to go away." Jesus says, "No, or we could feed them." So the disciples immediately like, "No, that's too hard. That's too difficult." And Jesus says, "Well, you got to figure it out." Right? They don't. Jesus performs the miracle of the feeding the 5,000. But what's fascinating is this little line, John's gospel. The disciples come and say, "Okay, we're going to get rid of these people." And the text says, "But Jesus was moved with compassion for them." The catalyst for Jesus was that the people who were unable to look after themselves were not being welcomed, were not being brought into the family in that sense. Jesus was compassionate towards them, and he broke through all of the cultural norms.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, you just see it time and time again. You think about, the paralyzed guy's friends dig a hole in the roof. Well, there's an example of privilege. He couldn't get into the spaces because he was not able-bodied, right?
Yeah.
So he has deep compassion on this man, heals him, right? Like, I mean, you just see it. Jesus riding into Jerusalem weeps over a city, right? Because there's just this
Yeah.
deep empathy and compassion for the people within that place. So you just
Yes.
like, as you every story, every interaction, which again are the highlights of Jesus's life. There's so many more we don't even know about. There's this driving empathy. And I love that you said that, subverts the culture around him. I think that is the right way to state that.
Well, and even you think of how often the disciples get caught up in theological discussion around issues. Jesus actually goes, well, how about we actually solve the issue, right? The guy that you talk about, the guy comes down through the roof, right? And let's have a theological conversation. Can Jesus forgive sins? And Jesus is like, or we can help the person.
Yeah.
So to me, here's like, maybe this is risky, but for me, this is where culture comes in. So a lot of churches will have the culture. Here's what we're doing, and if you fit, you're welcome. And if you don't fit, I'm sure there's another church in town that you will fit in.
Yes.
And that becomes institutional creep, right? Where the institution starts to overtake the value of the individual, the value of the person. Bob Osborne always used to say, "How does God count?" And it's like, here's one, and here's another one. And here's another one.
Yes.
Whereas we tend to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, look, there's 100 people. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas God counts us as individuals and counts us in our own sort of role. So for me, you look at this list. You alluded to it in the minute that McKnight talks about. Okay, so do we have empathy and compassion for women? Again, very, very aware of the fact there's two guys. Kristen will join us for some of the conversations. We probably should say that this series. Some days it will be me and Tyson. Some days it will be Tyson and Kristen. Some days it will be me and Kristen, and we're just going to kind of cycle through that. But women have had a horrendous time in the church, right?
Yep.
Despite the fact that throughout all of church history, women have generally made up between 50 and 60% of church membership has been women. And yet there's still arguments out there to this day. We podcasted about this a while ago. There's people still have arguments about women, whether they can have a role in church or not. Right? Okay. Not to then mention, you mentioned Willow Creek and Bill Hybels and various other, not to mention the fact that then what also happens is we're seeing that women and others are then, when they've been abused in church, no one believes them.
Yeah.
So there's horrendous stories that have gone on in recent years of some pretty high profile Christian ministries.
Yeah.
Ministries like Ravi Zacharias, for example, where women were telling very concerning stories for a lot of years about this, and everybody just dismissed them, and actually sometimes worse than that, attempted to keep them sort of shut down. So McKnight talks about the question about how have we been compassionate as the church. And compassion at this point and empathy at this point doesn't just go, oh my goodness, we've given women a hard time, but how do we correct that?
Yes.
Right. How do we then sort of live that out? What about the physically challenged? Right. Like some church buildings, just the building would make it almost impossible, to attend a church. Just if you had, a physical challenge of some sort. Like our buildings are often immensely ableist, and therefore, without even saying a word, we tell people, you're not actually welcome here.
Yes.
And that's a huge challenge, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it's and I mean the list goes on that Scott starts to work through, right? He talks about the widows and the widowers, and then the elderly that you mentioned, right? And then those of like different ethnic backgrounds, the divorced, and I would say that's one that would strike personally for me. I know someone very personal in my life who has had a divorce, walked into a church, tried to get a fresh start on his feet, and had someone meet him at the door and say, why are you out here? And he'd moved cities and just said, I just got a divorce, I'm looking for a new start. And the first response out of the person's mouth was, well, don't think you're going to come in and date anyone within this church with a nasty divorce. And that person walked out of the church and has never been back.
Mm.
Deeply personal in my life, deeply about, right? Again, the empathy, not knowing the storyline, not knowing anything, not having any care or thought or compassion towards what this person has walked through and experienced. Again, just an assumption, fear, right?
Yeah.
Law instead of grace. So,
Yeah. Well, I find myself thinking about James chapter 2. James is this little text at the back of the New Testament that gets ignored all the time. Maybe we should give a whole series to it at some point. But James chapter 2, let me just read this. James says, brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus must not show favoritism. Right? Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here's a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand there or sit on the floor by my feet, have you not discriminated amongst yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? And listen, my dear brothers and sisters, has God not chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom? He promised those who love him. But you've dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name of him to whom you belong? I mean, very, very, very harsh text.
Yeah.
But I think you can export that text into a whole host of scenarios of how, male leaders treat women, of how, married leaders treat single people, of how, the whole list of everybody that we've alluded to or talked about directly. We can so quickly get caught up in showing favoritism. And when we show favoritism, our empathy starts to sort of fade away and our compassion kind of diminishes and dies, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, that's again, the favoritism comes out of a protection of the institution, of how things appear, of what it looks like. Whereas the compassion piece is going to focus in on the individual person as an individual that is very unique and, as we all are, and that's good and celebrated, and doesn't, even if it costs something of the institution, a culture of empathy and compassion within a church is going to protect the individual over the institution itself.
Well, I mean, there's part of me always wants to say, if you look at the life of Jesus, one of the things you learn is that empathy ruins the production.
Yes.
Right. So like, hey, we're just trying to have a nice meal here. And now Jesus has got this kind of homeless person that he's now talking to, or we were just trying to have a good teaching session and somebody just put the roof in and dropped a person who needed healing down through the middle of the roof, or hey, Jesus, we just want to go home now. And you're going to ask us to feed 5,000 people. And that's, again, you get this challenge of culture.
Yeah.
Like, what are we going to do when the baby cries at the back of the service?
How do you respond?
How do we respond? Right.
Yeah.
And do we respond with empathy? Or do we respond with, let's protect the production? And so there's a part of me feels that the kind of, grown-up pants that we put on at some level as the church is to be brave enough to start, to pursue a culture of goodness, to pursue a culture of compassion. It means we're going to have to start making sacrifices about certain things that perhaps have become second nature to us.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe where we start to land it with our time here, because I think it's a good thing to reflect upon, even of what are those things we might need to sacrifice, right? And
that's even a great invitation to make.
Yes.
To actually, are we as leadership and as servants of this church community, are we open to hear what those sacrifices might look like?
Yes, very, very much so. And I think I would like to think that we are open. And we'll know where we're not when we get really defensive if something does come in and go, not that one. That will be the red flag for us. But I think it's maybe a point that we can land on as a reflection piece, even in our own lives, to say, in my own personal life, right? what are the areas that I'm potentially willing to sacrifice in to make sure that compassion and empathy is a part of what drives, even within my family unit, the culture that I'm trying to build there, that's going to be good for my neighbors and for the people that I interact with. For us, you're right, as church leaders, what are we willing to potentially sacrifice for the sake of compassion and empathy being a driving factor and a part of the culture that people experience when they come?